Greetings. Today is August 23rd, 2018, which just happens to mark the 69th birthday of the popular Christian apologist Dr. William Lane Craig, who you see on your screen. So I wanted to take a moment to treat today as an auspicious day to celebrate Dr. Craig just a little bit. And thus I'm quickly throwing together this video to share the impact that Dr. Craig's work has had on me personally. Now, as a disclaimer, I ask that you, the viewer, forgive the low quality of this video. Unfortunately, the devices I have access to at the present moment are very limited, so I'm putting this together from my phone, and thus, honestly, the quality cannot be helped. Anyway, to begin, I want to set the tone by starting with something that Luke Muehlhauser wrote about Dr. Craig in an entry on the Common Sense Atheism blog back in April of 2009. Scroll down to the relevant portion. Here we go. Nope, sorry, forgive me. Bear with me. So this is something that an atheist wrote about Dr. Craig back in, nearly a decade ago. He wrote, quote, "Craig's physical deterioration makes me especially sad. He is absolute perfection in debate performance. It's a good thing we have him on video because debaters on any topic should study him like actors study Brando." Now, I wanted to share that because I agree with the general sentiment expressed by Muehlhauser there. Honestly, Craig is a real gem, and thus, whenever it is that he retires from apologetics, many, including both atheists and theists alike, will feel the loss. Muehlhauser wrote those words nearly a decade ago, and thus, while of course I wish Dr. Craig many years of health and vigor, I am aware that he may retire before many of the younger apologists influenced by him would prefer. Those who know me know that I'm a former atheist, and I was once a particularly abrasive atheist at that. During that time, I used to enjoy debating religious topics with theists and Christians and Muslims in particular, and I had the sincere impression back then that there were no good arguments for God's existence, that religion was, just utter foolishness, not the sort of thing grown men believe or should believe. Then, about 18 years ago, a Muslim who, like me, was a philosophy major at the time, invited me to argue the existence of God with him. So, I happily obliged because I was confident that it would be as easy and simple as my past experiences had been. But it turned out that the experience was entirely different. The relevant Muslim presented arguments which were much tighter than I had experienced before, and he easily picked off my cheap rebuttals. At the end of our exchanges, I was left quite surprised, and it was then that he shared with me that he fully admitted that he had basically just lifted his arguments from the writings and debates of a Christian philosopher named William Lane Craig. Now, at that point, I was intrigued, so I began looking deeper into Craig. Admittedly, I was doing so fully with the intent of getting a better sense of his arguments and refuting them. So I bought a couple of his books, those being the Kalam Cosmological Argument, and as well as his the Cosmological Argument from Plato to Leibniz. If I recall correctly, one of those books was actually his doctoral dissertation, slightly revised for public consumption. And I got those two books, and I read them and reread them several times, and I read them carefully. I also got several of his debates on VHS and watched those, his debates with atheists mainly. And I was particularly impressed by his debate with Anthony Flew. I had been conditioned by my education to think of Anthony Flew as a towering intellect. And that's not to say that he wasn't, but it just so happened that in that debate, it seemed like Craig clearly won. His arguments just seemed superior. That surprised me. I was also really impressed by his performance against Peter Atkins. And with all these VHS tapes that I was watching of his various debates, and after spending considerable time reviewing both his books and his debates, I started to feel like I needed some help dealing with his arguments. So I bounced a few ideas off of people in the alt.atheism news group, which used to exist back then on Usenet. And I also discussed these topics with one of the professors of the philosophy courses I was taking at the time. but I was honestly underwhelmed by the responses that I got. It was essentially the cosmological argument was what struck me as the most impressive, and after a while it started to feel insurmountable. Beyond that, I was also at least bothered by Craig's moral argument. Now, I'll say that the latter argument, the moral argument, was tough for me, as on the one hand, his premise that objective moral laws exist struck me as based on a mere appeal to emotion. I was ready to say that, that's baseless. And yet, on the other hand, at my core, I felt that certain moral laws really just were obviously true. And so while I didn't particularly like the moral argument, I nonetheless found it troubling. But that aside, as I said, it was the cosmological argument, the first cause argument, which struck me as the most strong. And, I couldn't bring myself to accept the idea of an infinite regress of causes, and I found the idea of things popping into existence uncaused less and less palatable. And I also accepted the idea that the first cause in a causal chain would have to be a personal agent rather than an impersonal mechanical agent. And as a result, I basically conceded to a general theistic position. The thought that started to pop into my head at the time was that theism was rational rather than irrational. And I thought of myself as accepting theism simpliciter around 2003. Now, I began this video with an image of Dr. Craig from his first debate with Jamal Badawi, and which he debated Jamal Badawi back in 1997. Now, I started with this image, started with an image from that debate for two reasons. The first reason being a more general one, as it captures the Craig that I first encountered, the bearded Craig in his late 30s who seemed to be at the height of his intellectual powers, surprising atheists and Muslims alike. But the second reason is because when I saw specifically Craig's debate with Jamal Badawi, it ushered in a second layer of influence on me. Contemplating Craig's arguments brought me to a general theist position, but I wasn't satisfied with so-called theism simpliciter, and thus an already existing interest in Muslim-Christian debate came more into play. It sort of moved more to the forefront of my my thought process. And so, seeing the debate with Jamal Badawi, it really impressed me. At first, I was thankful for Craig pointing out the obvious, that essentially, he didn't word it like this, but this is the way I would have worded it after watching the debate, that if there was a historical Jesus, his crucifixion was about as sure a thing as, we could believe about him. Aside from that, Craig's argument that a perfectly loving God would be unconditionally loving really appealed to me at the time and shaped how I actually understood the Sermon on the Mount. Now, Craig himself didn't appeal to the relevant passage in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5 that I had in mind, but nonetheless, his argument in that regard about a perfectly loving God being an unconditionally loving God struck me as resonating with how I was reading the Sermon on the Mount at the time. I felt that the text, sort of subtly alluded to this deeper philosophical argument that Craig was presenting. Moreover, Craig's appeal to the parable of the vineyard in that debate with Jamal Badawi, the parable at the start of Mark 12, that really resonated with me, and that's an argument that's stayed with me to this day in a way that's stronger than some of the other arguments that he presented. See, because I had accepted that the parable was likely to have been uttered by the historical Jesus, and I took this alleged early layer of the New Testament as indicating that the historical Jesus may have actually affirmed his unique divine sonship, his death, and the finality of his prophethood. All of this is relevant to, Muslim-Christian debate. But aside from his debate with Jamal Badawi, what really bowled me over was Craig's debate with Shabat Ali at McMaster University in 2002 on the Christian and Muslim conceptions of God. Before seeing that debate, I had been attempting to sincerely get a sense of what the Bible says about the divinity of Christ and Christ's relationship with the Father. But I nonetheless considered the doctrine of the Trinity to be a necessary contradiction. It just seems so obvious to me. How can the Father be God and the Son be God, and yet the Father not be the Son? It just seems plainly obvious. If A equals C and B equals C, then A equals B, right? It seemed obviously contradictory to me. But in that debate, when Craig got into the differing interpretations of the copula, which was actually a subject I had gotten into in the philosophy of language a short while before seeing the debate, it was like a light went off in my mind. And I realized that the doctrine could be far more nuanced than I had anticipated. Or to put it another way, I realized that my attempt at a logical approach to the doctrine was overly simplistic. From then on, I tried to be more careful and open-minded in my exploration of the subject of the Trinity. And, initially, I didn't think that Craig had proved the Trinity true, but he had surprised me by offering a subtle nuance which presented a logically consistent version of the doctrine. And so it really resonated with me. Beyond that, and perhaps fortuitously, I quickly thereafter stumbled upon what Raymond Brown, in his commentary on John for the Anchor Bible, and Dan Wallace, in his Greek grammar, had each written regarding John 1:1c, employing a predication. And this amazed me because while I was impressed with Craig's ability to concoct a logically consistent version of the Trinity, I thought his appeal to copulas of predication was merely something he came up with on his own. Yet here I was, seeing serious scholars say that such appeared in the New Testament. And Brown, the aforementioned Raymond Brown, noted that the idea that there was a predication in John 1:1c was recognized at least as far back as John Chrysostom. To me, that was really impressive. But overall, to get the overall picture, try to imagine where I was at that point. So I'm in this stage of being unsatisfied with so-called theism simpliciter, and I'm contemplating Christianity and Islam. And there's a number of factors that come into play. First, I believe that the historical Jesus had been crucified. Second, I understood the Sermon on the Mount as containing a subtle allusion to a somewhat deep philosophical point which had been made by Craig. Third, I was very open to the likelihood that the historical Jesus may have made a statement alluding to his death, divine sonship, and the finality of his prophethood. And fourth, I had just been bowled over by the sense that A, my years-long objections to the Trinity on logical grounds lacked sufficient nuance, and B, a key philosophical nuance in Craig's version of the Trinity had biblical support. All of this contributed to me leaning towards Christianity rather than Islam. I think those who see the whole picture can see why. Now, there are a lot more details to what led me to the Christian faith, and many of those details do not involve Dr. William Lane Craig. But the point of this video is that Dr. Craig's apologetics work had nonetheless made a significant contribution to my move towards the Christian faith, which I finally embraced in 2007, so about 11 years ago. Before I close, I want to note that if someone were to ask me if I agree with Dr. Craig on everything, my answer would clearly be no. However, I fear that many people have an imbalance in how charitable they would prefer others be with them versus how charitably they themselves are willing to be towards public figures. That is to say, we would all prefer that others recognize that while we, of course, are fallible and we nonetheless have meaningful contributions to make on certain topics, even if we are not very well informed on certain other topics. However, when a person becomes relatively famous or becomes the focus of public attention, many unthinkingly deny that person the courtesy just mentioned. That is to say, when a person becomes celebrated, unfortunately there are others who act as though there are only two possible categories for that person. Either the person is infallible on every topic, or they're a witless crayfish. If they disagree with the person on any topic, or they think the person is wrong or misinformed on any point, they suddenly feel emboldened to wave the person off entirely, as if they were just, a complete fool or something like that. Now, I mention that because I think we should all strive to be more careful in how we perceive and describe others. For that reason, I wanted this video to note that while today I can think of points I might disagree with Dr. Craig on, I nonetheless cannot deny the impact that his work has had on me, and I think there is value in remembering the man's very real and significant contributions. I, for one, am grateful for the work that Dr. Craig has done, and I honestly feel privileged to have come into contact with his writings and his debates. With that in mind, I want to take a look at another blog entry on the aforementioned Luke Muehlhauser's Common Sense Atheism blog. This one's also from a decade ago. Bear with me one second. Okay. So this is something that Luke Muehlhauser wrote about Dr. Craig in February of 2009, right? So he writes, William Lane Craig is a prolific Christian philosopher, apologist, author, and public debater. He is the best debater on any topic that I've ever heard. As far as I can tell, he has won nearly all his debates with atheists. When debating him, atheists have consistently failed to put forward solid arguments and consistently failed to point out flaws in Craig's arguments. And I'm not the only one who thinks that Craig has won nearly all his debates. For some atheists, it's rather maddening. Craig is a skilled debater, an encyclopedia of facts and quotes, and a careful rhetorician. If you make a logical mistake, Craig knows exactly how to skewer you for it, and for this I respect him. He holds prepared and persuasive responses to everything an atheist might say, and atheists usually fail to clearly point out the logical flaws that Craig has to say. Also, Craig does a great job of summarizing the points and counterpoints that have been raised during a debate, and presents them in a way to show he has decisively won. His opponents are never organized or clear. Now, I want to remind the viewers that this is an entry on the Common Sense Atheism blog by Luke Muehlhauser, who's himself an atheist. Interestingly enough, when he mentioned that for some other atheists it's rather maddening, he has a link to another blog entry, which someone else, or another website. I'd like to take a peek at that real quick. So it's this article, which is no longer available in itself. The link is now broken, but it's to a former, it was like a repository of responses to William Lane Craig, which was maintained by Mark Smith. So this is also from a decade ago. It's now archived on archive.org. The actual page no longer exists. But I just wanted to, being that the Luke Muehlhauser linked to it, I wanted to zero in on one interesting thing that he wrote. He had an interesting analogy. Now, this is someone, when you read through it, in many respects, this atheist is a lot more hostile to Craig. He has a lot of sharp language when describing Craig's arguments. Yet, nonetheless, he writes something interesting. He has an interesting analogy. Let me see if I can zero in on it here. Okay, here we go. Bear with me one second. Okay, sorry about that. Oop. Okay, so he writes, us atheists continue to pretend, us atheists, forgive me, doing this live, and so, well, not live from your perspective, but doing this on the spot, so there's a little bit of sloppiness. So he writes, us atheists continue to send sucker after sucker into the ring to face the Mike Tyson of theological debate. And us atheists continue to pretend that 98-pound weaklings stand a chance against Craig. Please, wake up, fellow atheists. Get your head out of your backsides long enough to be able to see clearly what the heck is happening here. If we expect Christians to be honest about anything, we as a group need to be honest as well, and honestly face the fact that Craig is kicking our collective behind, and we're apparently too dumb as a group to even know it. Heck, we're so dumb, we continue to send in our Hercules against their Mike Tyson and expect a miracle. I just wanted to share those couple of examples of atheists about a decade ago having a very high opinion of Craig, even when they had sharp disagreements with him, because I think it also relates to the fact that even if you don't agree with everything that the man has to say, and honestly, that would be the case with every human being. I think just about, every single human being you know or see on TV or encounter on the internet, you'll probably be able to find something you disagree with them on. But the point here is that I think those atheist statements provide a lesson for us, and also for Christians who have various doctrinal disagreements with Dr. Craig. Even if you disagree with him on certain points, you should still be able to acknowledge his talents and his contributions. And that was the point of this video. So on that note, I want to say happy birthday to William Lane Craig, and I hope others found this very brief discussion interesting, even if it was somewhat sloppy. All right, everybody, God bless.